When I opened the door to my apartment, I saw my son and daughter-in-law standing there. They forced polite smiles and said they had come to make peace. That was strange, because 6 months earlier, they were the ones who had kicked me out of the house I had lived in for more than 40 years. Not a single phone call, not a single message. And yet now, they stood in front of me as if nothing had ever happened. When they stepped inside, both of them suddenly fell utterly silent. Before you continue, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us. This is a place where family stories are shared, so we can listen together, learn about respect, and ensure that no one has to endure pain alone. Because what they saw behind that door was not the weak, aging mother they once looked down on. And I knew that from that very moment, they began to realize a mistake they might have to pay for a very long time. My name is Helen. I am 68 years old. I have spent almost my entire life as a wife and a mother, with no personal career and no savings in my own name. After my husband passed away, I became the kind of person society easily overlooks. An older woman, living quietly and dependent on her family. But there is one thing they did not understand. I am no longer young, but I am not weak. Before everything happened, my family was once very ordinary, not wealthy, no major turmoil, just a family living a quiet life in the suburbs. My husband, Richard, worked steadily. I stayed home and took care of everything else. We raised Daniel in a house that was not luxurious, but was complete. I always believed it was a good enough life. For many years, I grew used to standing in the background. I woke up early to cook, clean, and take care of my husband and child. When Daniel was young, I stayed up through many sleepless nights whenever he was sick. When he got married, I was still there, watching my grandchild when needed, cooking whenever they visited, and helping without ever keeping track. I never thought of myself as a sacrificial person. I only thought it was my role. And I believed that when I needed my family, they would not turn their backs on me. Everything began to change after Richard's passing. The house suddenly felt empty. At first, Daniel and his wife, Sophia, still visited often. They told me not to worry, that I still had family to support me. However, the visits became less frequent thereafter. The phone calls grew shorter. Sophia often said she was busy. Daniel was often silent. I began to feel like I was a burden, even though no one said it out loud. When Sophia became pregnant, the atmosphere in the house shifted even more. They began discussing expenses, the future, and responsibilities. I listened, but I did not speak. I did not want to become a burden. There were dinners when I realized I was sitting there but no longer being asked for my opinion. Plans were discussed as if I were not present. Casual remarks, seemingly harmless, made me feel as though I was being slowly pushed aside. I told myself that maybe I was just too sensitive, that every parent has to accept that their children will have lives of their own. I tried to stay silent more often, to give in more, hoping everything would be fine, but I did not know that while I was trying to hold the family together, somewhere else, a decision to push me out of my own home was already taking shape, and I did not know that I was moving very close to a moment that would change my entire life. Everything happened on an afternoon I still remember clearly. Daniel and Sophia arrived at the house without warning. There were no familiar smiles, no casual questions. They sat across from me. The distance was not far, but I felt as though they were standing on the opposite side. Daniel was the first to speak. His voice was dry, as if he were reading through a task that needed to be completed. He said Sophia was pregnant. He said they needed their own space. He said the house was too big for just one person to live in. I listened, trying to understand. I said I was willing to downsize my belongings, give up a room, and change my habits. I thought this was just a family conversation. Then Daniel placed a stack of papers on the table. He did not look at me as he spoke. His name was on the house documents. Richard had added our son's name years earlier to avoid legal complications in the future. I froze. I had never imagined it could be used this way. That was when Sophia finally spoke. She crossed her arms and looked at me with cold eyes. She said I had depended on the family for too long, that I should find a smaller place, more appropriate for my age, that I was standing in the way of their new life. I asked very softly whether they were asking me to leave the house. Sophia nodded. Daniel stayed silent. My heart started pounding hard. I reminded them of the years I had lived there, the meals, the memories with Richard. I said this was my home. Sophia gave a small smile. It was not a warm smile. She said memories do not pay the bills. The baby needed a stable home, not the complaints of an older woman. Those words took my breath away for several seconds. I turned to Daniel. I waited for my son to say something, just one sentence, one moment of hesitation. But he said nothing. He avoided my eyes as if not looking would make it easier. Daniel said I had 1 week to pack my things. After that, they would change the locks. I asked where I was supposed to go. I said I did not have enough money to rent a proper place. Sophia rubbed her stomach and said that was not their problem. In that moment, I understood very clearly. I was no longer Daniel's mother in that house. I was just an obstacle in their life. When they stood up to leave, no one hugged me. No one turned back. The door closed, and I stood alone in the house I once believed was the safest place in my life. That night, I sat on the living room floor for a long time. I did not cry right away. I only felt empty. After more than 40 years as a wife and a mother, I realized I had just been pushed aside like something no longer needed. And I did not know yet that this was only the beginning of an even darker chapter waiting ahead. I left that house after exactly 7 days. None of them was there. No goodbye, no farewell. I placed the keys on the kitchen counter where I had stood cooking for decades, then pulled my suitcase toward the door. I did not have much to take with me. Old clothes, a few photographs, some important documents, more than 40 years of my life, compressed into a few cardboard boxes. The only place I could afford was a cheap boarding house on the edge of the city. The room was small and low with damp walls. The window looked out onto a parking lot filled with trash. The bed creaked every time I turned over. The bathroom was shared with people I had never spoken to. That first night, I could not sleep. Traffic noise from the street, arguments from the next room. I lay staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering where I had gone wrong. The days that followed passed very slowly. I began looking for work, cleaning jobs, babysitting, caring for the elderly, the same kinds of work I had done my entire life, only this time I needed to be paid. But everywhere I went, I received polite rejections. They said I was too old. They said I should be resting. They said they would call back, but they never did. I began to understand that at my age, I was almost invisible. No one needed my experience. No one needed my devotion. They only needed me not to be a nuisance. My small savings slowly ran out. I bought the cheapest food possible, stale bread, instant noodles, food close to its expiration date. There were days when I ate only one meal, just to stretch things a little longer. I lost weight quickly. My clothes hung loosely. The face in the mirror grew gaunt. But no one noticed. No one asked. Nights were the worst. I missed the old kitchen. I missed the chair where Richard used to sit and read the newspaper. I missed the feeling of belonging somewhere. Once, I couldn't hold it in and started crying. The person in the next room banged hard on the wall and told me to be quiet. In that moment, I felt so small it was as if there was no place left for me to exist. I called Daniel several times. The phone rang, then went dead. I left messages just asking about his health. No one replied. I texted Sophia to ask about her pregnancy. She replied briefly, saying I should stop bothering them. One afternoon, while walking past a shopping center, I saw Sophia from a distance. She was wearing new clothes, shopping bags in her hands. Her belly was bigger. I called her name out of instinct. Sophia turned and looked at me. A flash of surprise crossed her face, quickly replaced by irritation. She asked what I was doing there, her voice low and rushed. I said I just wanted to check in. She glanced around as if afraid someone might see her talking to me. Then she said everything was fine, as long as I didn't show up anymore. After that, she turned away. I stood there for a long time, in the middle of the passing crowd. No one noticed. That evening, I returned to my room, sat on the bed, and thought for a long time. I realized I had been doing one thing for many years. I had always begged for acceptance. I have always tried not to be a burden, always given in, hoping to be loved. And that was precisely what had made it so easy to push me aside. That night, I made a decision. I would not call anymore. I would not text anymore. I would not beg anyone to remember me. If they saw me as someone who no longer existed, then I would begin living as if I had only myself left. And for the first time in many years, I thought about protecting myself. Everything began by pure chance, one afternoon as I was rearranging the few boxes I had brought from the old house. I wasn't doing it out of hope. I simply needed to make the room feel less cramped. In an old cardboard box beneath yellowed photographs, I noticed a thick envelope. My name was written on the front in Richard's familiar handwriting. I froze. I didn't remember ever opening this envelope. I sat down on the bed, holding it for a long time before I dared to open it. Inside was a letter. Richard wrote that if I were reading these words, he was probably no longer by my side. He apologized for not telling me certain things while he was alive, not because he didn't trust me, but because he wanted me to live a peaceful life without worry. Richard explained that many years earlier, when he was younger, he had purchased a few small plots of land on the outskirts of the city. At the time, they were almost worthless. He had seen them as a safety net, something we might never need. He wrote that, if I ever found myself in difficulty, I should go to the bank where he had kept the documents. The safe deposit box number was clearly written. The key, he said, was taped behind our wedding photo frame. I let the letter fall to my lap and felt my heart racing. I wasn't happy. I was confused. I was afraid I had misunderstood something. I searched for the old wedding photo frame, the one I had brought with me as the only keepsake of that marriage. On the back, just as Richard had written, a minor key was carefully taped in place. I held it in my hand, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to believe. Another part was afraid of hoping, only to be disappointed again. A few days later, I decided to go to the bank. Not with certainty, but simply to check for myself. I didn't say much. I just handed over the documents and the key. The bank employee led me into a small room. When the safe was opened, I saw neatly organized folders inside. Land deeds, maps. A valuation report was recently updated. The number on it made me sit down. Not from joy, but from shock. The total value of those assets was far beyond anything I had ever imagined. About $1.5 million. I sat there for a long time. I thought about the damp boarding room, about the cheap meals, about how I had been pushed aside. But instead of feeling relieved, I felt weighed down. If I had known sooner, would things have been different? If Daniel and Sophia had known, would they have treated me differently? I took all the documents home but told no one. I didn't tell the neighbors. I didn't call my son. I didn't make any changes right away. I knew one thing very clearly. This truth was not a victory. It was only a door that had just begun to open, and I wasn't sure yet if I was ready to take the step. After leaving the bank, I didn't do anything right away. I didn't move. I didn't shop. I didn't call Daniel or Sophia. I needed time to think, not about the money, but about myself. For many years, I had lived within a very familiar pattern, believing that if I were patient enough, if I sacrificed enough, everything would be fine. But reality showed me the opposite. When you have nothing to protect yourself with, kindness is easily mistaken for a sign of weakness. I began learning things I had never thought I would need to know. I found a lawyer. not to sue anyone, but to understand my legal standing, to understand what my rights were, to understand the boundary between helping and being taken advantage of. The lawyer spoke straightforwardly to me. The most important thing at the moment was discretion. No one needed to know what I had. No one needed to know what I was thinking. I nodded. For the first time in my life, I understood the value of silence. I established a straightforward legal structure to manage the assets. Nothing complicated, just enough to make sure everything was held safely. It wasn't an ambitious move, just a layer of protection. A few weeks later, I moved out of the boarding house. Not to any luxurious place, just a clean, quiet apartment where no one paid attention. A place where I could breathe without worrying about bothering anyone. I changed my appearance very little. I cut my hair more neatly, bought a few well-fitting outfits. Not to draw attention, just enough so that when I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw a woman trying to disappear. The most significant change wasn't on the outside. It was how I thought. I no longer rushed to help anyone. I no longer felt the need to explain who I was or what I had done. I began asking questions instead of rushing to answer. I began listening instead of rushing to agree. Some nights, I wondered if I was becoming someone else, someone colder, less trusting. But then I realized I hadn't lost my kindness. I had only learned how to place it correctly. I wasn't planning revenge. Truly, I wasn't. I was only preparing for a possibility I knew would eventually come, the day Daniel would realize that life doesn't function on impulsive decisions alone. The day Sophia would understand that pushing someone out doesn't erase responsibility. I knew they would face difficulties, not because of anything I did, but because of their own choices. And when that day came, I didn't want to be standing there with empty hands carrying nothing but old wounds. I wanted to have the right to choose, to help or not to help, to forgive or not to forgive. All of it had to be my decision, not because I had no other options. For the first time in many years, I felt that I was standing firmly on my own 2 feet, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, but solidly. And I didn't know that while I was learning how to protect myself, somewhere else, the cracks in Daniel's family were beginning to widen, slowly leading them toward the door behind which I was standing. I once thought that after learning the truth about the assets Richard left behind, everything would become clearer. But reality was the opposite. The more I knew, the more I understood that I was stepping into completely unfamiliar territory. The lawyer was very straightforward with me. The assets were tangible. The paperwork was valid. But how I used them was what truly mattered. One small mistake could lead to significant legal trouble. One hasty decision could expose my identity. One careless step could cause me to lose control. I realized this was no longer just the story of an abandoned mother. It was the story of an older woman trying to relearn how to protect herself in a world that had become unfamiliar to her. There were nights when I couldn't sleep. I thought about Daniel, about the way my son had avoided my eyes that day. I wondered if things went too far, I would still recognize myself. I also thought about Richard. If he were still alive, would he want me to walk this path? Or would he simply want me to be safe, spared from further hurt? One of the plots of land Richard had bought years ago had issues. Old paperwork, unclear boundaries. The lawyer said resolving it could take time, possibly years. I stood before a choice. I could sell quickly and accept a loss, or I could hold on facing legal risk and prolonged exhaustion. For the first time, I understood how it felt to make decisions with no one standing behind you, no family member to ask for advice. No one can guarantee that you are doing the right thing. At times, I thought about stopping, keeping everything at a level that was simple enough to live on, not getting further involved, not stepping any deeper. But then I remembered the damp boarding room. The rejections were based solely on my age. The feeling of being treated like a burden. If I stopped now, I might be safe. but I might also return to the same old position, someone who could be pushed aside at any moment. I began to understand that the most significant risk wasn't losing money. It was losing my sense of purpose. It was returning to a life without choice. I decided to move forward, but more slowly, more carefully, without letting emotions lead the way. I didn't buy or sell recklessly. I didn't change my lifestyle abruptly. Everything was broken down into smaller steps, controlled piece by piece. There were moments when I almost made a mistake, an offer that seemed too good, an opportunity that felt impossible to ignore. The lawyer had to stop me. That moment sent a chill down my spine. Just a little greed, a little impatience, and everything could have collapsed. I realized that real power doesn't lie in how much you have. It lies in how patient you can be. The greatest struggle didn't come from the outside. It came from within me, between the desire to protect myself and the fear of becoming someone I didn't want to be. I didn't want to hurt Daniel, even though he had hurt me deeply. I didn't want revenge, but I also didn't want to be stepped on again. Ultimately, I made an obvious choice for myself. I would continue, but not beyond the boundaries of my conscience. I would keep the power of choice in my hands, but not let it turn into bitterness. I didn't know how it would all end. I only knew that, for the first time in my life, I was walking forward with my eyes wide open, fully aware of the risks ahead and willing to accept them. And while I was moving forward carefully, step by step on the other side, Daniel and Sophia's lives were beginning to show cracks they could no longer hide. Their choices, like mine, were slowly leading all of us toward an unavoidable confrontation. The call came on a morning I did not expect. I was sitting by the window of my apartment, drinking tea and looking down at the quiet street below when my phone vibrated. It was Daniel. I let it ring for a few more seconds before answering. Not because I wanted to seem important. I just needed to breathe so my voice wouldn't shake. Daniel said he wanted to see me. His voice was different from before. No certainty, no urgency. The only fatigue I had ever heard in my son's voice. He didn't say much over the phone. He only asked if we could meet to talk. I agreed, slowly without adding anything. We agreed to meet at my apartment. I didn't explain further. There was no need. That afternoon, I prepared very simply. No heavy makeup, no elaborate clothes, just a neat, clean outfit. I didn't want to make an impression. I just wanted to be myself. When the doorbell rang, I stood up calmly. I knew this moment would come sooner or later. Daniel and Sophia were standing outside the door. Both of them looked very different from the last time I had seen them. Daniel had lost weight. His shoulders sagged. Sophia looked tired, her face lacking the confidence she once had. I opened the door and stepped aside. No hugs, no reproach, just an invitation to come in. The moment they stepped inside, I noticed the change immediately. Not because the apartment was beautiful or luxurious, but because of the quiet, the sense of stability, a space they hadn't expected me to be able to create for myself. They stood there for a few seconds, saying nothing. Sophia looked around, then lowered her eyes. Daniel swallowed hard, as if searching for a way to begin. I didn't rush. I sat down. I gestured for them to sit if they wished. No urging, no questions. The silence stretched on, and that silence made them more uncomfortable than any accusation could have. Finally, Daniel spoke. He said that things were complicated, unstable work, financial pressure, hasty decisions come back with consequences. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't nod. I just listened. Sophia added a few words about the pregnancy, about the anxiety, about the feeling of losing control. Her voice trembled, but it was no longer as sharp as before. I remained silent. There was a moment when Daniel looked straight at me. His eyes no longer avoided mine. There was only confusion and a trace of regret. He said that maybe they had been too hasty. Maybe they had hurt me more than they realized. I looked at my son. For a long time. I didn't ask why. I didn't repeat their words back to them. I said only one sentence, very slowly. That's when they decided to push me out of that house. They didn't just push out a mother, they pushed away trust itself. The room fell silent again. Sophia lowered her head. I saw her hand rest on her stomach instinctively, as if to steady herself. Daniel exhaled, his hands clasped together. I didn't say anything more. I let them sit with what they had just heard. After a while, Daniel said they hadn't come to ask for money. That sentence made me look directly at my son, not with suspicion, just with an obvious gaze. I asked gently what they had come for, then. Daniel didn't answer right away. Sophia turned to look at her husband, then at me. Finally, she said they had come because they didn't know what to do anymore. That answer, for the first time, sounded real. In that moment, I understood something very clearly. Power didn't lie in what I held in my hands. It lay in the fact that, for the first time, they couldn't make decisions on my behalf. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to prove anything. Just by sitting there, I was in a completely different position from the last time we met. Daniel said he was sorry, not loudly, not pleading, just an awkward, belated apology. I listened. And I didn't say right away whether I accepted it or not, because I knew this meeting wasn't meant to end everything. It was only in the first moment that they began to realize that the woman they once looked down on was no longer standing in a place where she could be easily pushed aside, and I also knew that the most challenging part was still ahead. After Daniel's apology, the room fell silent again. Not the heavy silence from before, but a space for everyone to think. I looked at my son and realized that, in that moment, he was no longer the man who had once stood in front of me holding house documents. He looked exhausted, awkward, and somewhat afraid. I understood one thing very clearly. If I spoke too gently, everything would return to the way it was. If I spoke too harshly, the door that had just opened would slam shut. So I chose to speak the truth. No embellishment, no anger. I said that what hurt me most wasn't being forced out of the house. What hurt me most was being forced out of the house. It was the way they had done it. No real conversation. No basic respect for the person who had lived her entire life in that home. I said that family is not a place where people remember each other only when they need something. Family is also not a relationship where a person's value is measured by whether they are still helpful. Sophia looked up at me. Her eyes wavered. I knew she was listening. I continued slowly. I said that I understood their pressures, the pregnancy, the money, the future. But I would not accept those pressures being used as an excuse to push someone else out, especially a mother. I said that if they were sitting here today, it was because I could help them. Then they needed to understand one thing clearly. Between family and self-interest, there is an obvious boundary. Family is respect, even when there is nothing left to give. Self-interest occurs when people return only because they believe they can benefit from something. I didn't say which side they were on. I let them think about it on their own. Daniel lowered his head. He said he had been wrong, that he hadn't been brave enough to stand up for me when Sophia said things that hurt me. I nodded. No blame, no comfort. I only said that recognizing a mistake is the first step, but it isn't the only one. I said that I could help them, but that help would no longer be unconditional. The room grew tenser. Sophia squeezed Daniel's hand. Both of them waited for me to continue. I stated my conditions clearly. First, they had to publicly acknowledge that they had treated me wrongly, not to humiliate them, but so they themselves would understand that actions have consequences and cannot be erased by a few private apologies. Second, any significant decisions about their lives going forward, if they involved my support, had to be discussed openly and honestly. No secrecy. No putting me in a position where everything was already decided. I didn't want to control them, but I would not accept being taken advantage of ever again. Third, I needed to see change through actions, not promises. I didn't need daily phone calls, but I needed consistency, respect even the most minor things. I paused, giving them time to absorb it. Daniel exhaled slowly. He asked whether that meant I would never trust them again. I answered honestly. That trust isn't something that switches back on after a single meeting. However, it is also not something that's lost forever if people truly change. Only then did Sophia speak. She said she was afraid of making another mistake, afraid I would never accept her. I looked at her and said that I didn't expect perfection. I only expected kindness and responsibility. I added one final thing, that if I helped, I would help as a mother and a grandmother, not as a lifeline for them to cling to and then forget everything else. Help comes with responsibility, and if that responsibility is taken lightly, I will stop. The room remained silent for a long time after that. No one objected. No one made excuses. I knew that in that moment they understood that this relationship had entered a different phase, no longer built on habit. No longer built on one-sided sacrifice, but built on boundaries. And for the first time, those boundaries made me feel that I was no longer in the weaker position. After I finished stating my conditions, Daniel and Sophia didn't respond right away. They sat there in silence, as if for the first time they truly had to consider the consequences of what they had done. I didn't rush them. I had waited a long time for a conversation like this. A few more minutes of silence no longer made me uneasy. Finally, Daniel nodded. Not the hurried nod of someone looking for an escape, but the heavy nod of someone who understood there were no easy choices left. He said he accepted, not because I could help, but because he understood that if he didn't change, he would lose more than he already had. Sophia nodded as well. She didn't say much. She only said that she agreed and would do exactly what I asked. I didn't smile, not because I was cold, but because I knew this was not the moment for relief. I began by helping them address their immediate problems, but in a way that didn't revert everything back to its previous state. I didn't give them cash. I didn't take on all their responsibilities on their behalf. I only opened doors that they had to walk through themselves. I introduced Daniel to an old acquaintance of Richard's, someone who was seeking a responsible and experienced worker. There were no guarantees, just a fair chance at an interview. I made it clear that if Daniel showed up late, acted irresponsibly, or fell back into his old behavior, I would not intervene again. Daniel understood that. I could see the tension on his face. But I also saw something else, a seriousness I had rarely seen before. For Sophia, I helped her access an appropriate healthcare program during her pregnancy. Nothing luxurious, just safe and stable. I wasn't by their side every day. I didn't control every small thing. I kept enough distance so they would have to stand on their own. The most critical issue was the house, the place where all the hurt had begun. I didn't go back there, and I didn't demand that they leave immediately either. But I made it clear that that house would never again be a place where I could be pushed out. We agreed on a straightforward arrangement. For now, they could stay there to stabilize their lives and prepare for the baby's arrival. But everything came with a time limit and responsibilities. No one was allowed to take it for granted. There were moments in the weeks that followed when I felt myself wanting to soften, when Sophia called with a tired voice, when Daniel talked about a stressful day at work, but each time I reminded myself of the damp boarding room. I remembered the feeling of being treated as if I didn't exist, not to nurture resentment, but to make sure I didn't lose myself again. Gradually, I began to see change, not dramatic, not loud. Daniel started calling before making important decisions, not to ask permission, but to ask for advice. A minimal difference, but a very real one. Sophia began speaking to me in a calmer tone. No more careless remarks that caused pain. No more defensive looks like before. I didn't rush to call it reconciliation. I simply called it a step in the right direction. One afternoon, standing alone in my apartment, I realized something very clearly. I didn't need to win against anyone. I just needed to stop losing myself. Helping them was no longer an obligation for me. It was a conscious choice. And for the first time in this entire story, I felt that I was doing the right thing. Not because I was stronger than they were, but because I had learned how to hold boundaries while still keeping compassion. One evening, I sat alone in my apartment, turning off all the lights except for the faint glow from the city outside the window. There were no urgent calls anymore. No decisions had to be made immediately. Everything was quiet in a way very different from the loneliness I once knew. I've been thinking about the past few months, from the moment I stood at the door of the old house, to the cramped boarding room, to the envelope Richard left behind, and to the confrontation with Daniel and Sophia. I didn't defeat anyone, but I was no longer the one being pushed aside. Some things could never return. The trust I once had, the innocence of believing that family alone would protect me. But there were also new things that had formed. Respect, clear boundaries, and a fragile but real chance to build something different. I didn't know what the future would hold. I wasn't sure whether Daniel and Sophia would keep their promise. I didn't know if I would ever fully let go of the old wounds. But I knew one thing. For the first time in my life, I was no longer afraid of being left behind. I thought about the child who would soon be born, a life not yet carrying any of the adult's mistakes. I wondered whether that child would grow up in a family that listened better, that respected those who came before. Perhaps forgiveness isn't about forgetting. Perhaps it's about choosing not to let the past control the future. I stood up and poured myself a cup of tea. Unhurried, unworried, life didn't return to what it once was, but it was no longer as hopeless as I had once believed. And as I looked out the window and saw the city lights still shining, I asked myself a question that perhaps everyone must answer on their own. In the family, are we choosing to love each other out of habit, or because we truly understand and respect one another? If this story made you think, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Every family carries its own wounds, and sometimes being heard is already a step toward healing. If stories like this resonate with you, stay with the channel so we can keep learning together how to love and respect one another more deeply.